Welcome back, everyone. This will be the third video for Chapter 3, discussing the audience effects of video gaming in terms of psychology and learning. Now, I do want to warn you that this video goes over a lot of effects, particularly of violent gaming and sexism. And so there are some very difficult, challenging topics about this. And so I recognize that some of the video that I will be showing is very violent in nature and displays some sexist imagery. It is meant to expose you to the things that are going on in the gaming world. But I wanted you to be aware of that so that you can recognize that you may be seeing some things that make you a bit uncomfortable. Please remember, as always, that if you have concerns about the content, if you feel triggered by anything here, there are mental health professionals available at the University of Montevallo. Counseling services are free. And let me just say, outside of just the instructor of MC 100, that I highly promote the Counseling Center. We're going through a pandemic, and our country is going through so many changes that it can be very helpful to reach out and take care of yourself mentally. So I highly encourage you to make an appointment, even if you're not experiencing any mental health crises, just to have someone to talk to and work through these emotional issues. But with that said, I did want to give that video disclaimer, but please know that I tried to modify the content so it wouldn't be emotionally sensitive to the area that I need it to be. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and start. You may recognize some of these gentlemen from news or documentaries about mass shootings in America. The two people on the left are the shooters from Columbine. The person in the middle was the shooter at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And the man on the right was the shooter at the Aurora, Colorado movie theater. What do all three of these shooters have in common? They love to play violent video games. And so, with mass shootings, a common topic that is brought up is that shooters tend to play violent video games. They tend to immerse themselves in these worlds of digital gaming. And so there have been concerns raised both in the media and within research that video games could be creating a more violent culture. So let's examine that.
There's no way anyone beats him!
Video games are everywhere nowadays, invading your living rooms, storming your phones, even taking the blame for society's ills.
These video games to dehumanize individuals.
Like after the recent wave of shootings when American politicians shared thoughts, prayers, and concerns about video games.
This was maybe a video game to this evil demon. He wanted to be a super soldier for his Call of Duty game.
Even the president urged us to stop the glorification of violence in our society, including
the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace.
Objection!
Let's debunk this whole video games causes violence red herring once and for all.
You lose. Continue.
I'm Charlie Goldberg. I've been reporting on video games for 8 years. I've been a lifelong video game player. I've amassed nearly 2 million subscribers on my gaming YouTube channel. And well, I play a lot of video games. The violent ones. The shooter ones more specifically. I also love Legos. I'm a father. I know I'm just one gamer, but I'm not a threat to society, and neither are the millions of other people who play video games. Let's take a look at the world of evidence. American video game sales per person are on similar levels to countries like South Korea, Japan, or Germany. But our rate of violent gun deaths is 10 to 100 times higher than any of those countries. Even within America, there is zero empirical evidence that video games are linked to mass shootings. Decades of research from the American Psychological Association have shown there's no link between playing violent video games and participating in violent crime.
This all looks nominal.
No link, no evidence.
So you can see from this opinion piece from the New York Times, which I will, caveat that this is an opinion. This is just one person's perspective as he shares. However, it brings up a very common complaint from video gamers that there are millions and millions of gamers, and yet it seems that gaming gets blamed anytime there's a violent event in America. So, why does that happen? Well, research has shown that there is no significant relationship between violent video game exposure and school shooting incidents. And yet it continues to be brought up with every mass shooting. However, there is a significant positive correlation between exposure to violent video games and adolescent aggression. So, while there is no evidence that playing a video game will cause you to go out and do something catastrophic like a school shooting, there is a correlation, research-based correlation that suggests that active exposure to violent video games over a long period of time can increase the level of aggression for young adults. The negative effects of violent video games then are does not mean that every single person who plays a violent video game will become violent themselves, but there is a stronger link in research that suggests that there is an increased aggression the more you play. Now, multiple studies have found this effect that video games increase aggression, but those effects tend to be short term, meaning that video games will prime or activate this aggression related mental script within your mind. But those effects tend to last minutes or hours and not become a characteristic for most people. It also requires repeated exposure that over time hardwire your mental structures to think in a more aggressive way. But when we're talking about repeated exposure, we're talking about playing hours and hours of violent video games every single day. So we're not talking about the casual gamer or even someone who plays it, a couple of times a week. We're talking about someone who devotes their entire life to these violent video games may experience these effects on a more long term. There is very little longitudinal data or long term, spread out over time data available to researchers on violent video games. But you can see from what little longitudinal data that we have that repeated exposure to violent video games can result in an increase in aggression. And it is important to note that just like the opinion piece mentioned in the New York Times, this effect actually is seen in gaming populations worldwide. And so, again, it is not necessarily a cultural based thing, but there does seem to be a small long term event effect of violent video game exposure when the exposure to video games is repeated over and over again. Now, there are also studies that suggest that there is a link to higher levels of aggressive thoughts, emotions, and behaviors for repeated exposure to violent video game playing. There is a decrease in empathy and willingness to help others to when this is repeated over long periods of time. When video games reward violent behavior, it can increase the hostile nature of the gamer. But again, these tend to be more short term effects that last minutes or hours. There is also a dehumanization mechanism that is increasing aggression. So, the more that you are killing actual people, as opposed to like killing aliens or zombies, when you're actually killing people in a violent video game, studies show that there is a level of dehumanization and desensitization to violent acts, especially when those players tend to be less experienced. So, when you're much younger and you have less exposure to violence as a whole, when your first introduction to violence in society is through video games, these effects of dehumanization and desensitization to violence tend to be higher. But experienced players, those who continue to play over time, actually show little reaction due to already being extremely desensitized. And so it means that there is kind of like this buildup of desensitization. And so it affects you less and less the more that you play. Now, one of the most famous studies that a lot of media response to violent video games being linked to mass casualty incidents comes from a study from 2009 by Bartlett, which showed that 15 minutes of playing Mortal Kombat, which if you've never played it, you should, and two is about street fighting using I don't know uh, combat style fighting, particularly of Asian influence. But just playing 15 minutes of the game Mortal Kombat significantly increased physical arousal and aggressive thoughts and behaviors. So they were saying that even a tiny bit of exposure can increase your arousal, your, getting hyped up, and your aggression. But when you really look at this study and look at its findings more in depth, the study very clearly states that these thoughts and feelings last less than 4 minutes after you stop playing the game. And so, aggressive behavior and that elevated heart rate can last for 10 minutes. But again, this does not mean that a link to playing Mortal Kombat means you're going to go shoot up your school or even try to street fight, right? But high qualities show that gamers are more inclined to inflict higher levels of discomfort on others. But those studies tend to show these effects more on a short-term basis. But there is the other side of this research that suggests that aggression and violence are not very clearly defined. For instance, how would you define aggression? Does it mean just being willing to hurt someone? Is it a biological factor of your heart rate increasing or a certain part of your brain activating? Most violent video game studies don't actually define these terms very well, and therefore the results can be very confusing. In addition, most studies typically only use one particular game for a fixed amount of time. So it is hard to know if exposure to different types of games or for different amounts of playing time will have different effects. And most of these studies are trying to establish a causal relationship between real life aggression and playing video games, but that would demand consideration of other variables, such as how old you are, what gender you are, your personality type. So it's hard to determine a causal relationship when there are so many other factors at play. If you've ever done a class in research, you know that these are confounding factors and they can hurt the direct relationship to, say, violent video games cause aggression. Many studies are also conducted with small, non random, and non representative samples, meaning that their generalizability or their ability to translate to the general public is diminished by this lack of rigorous sampling. And so, despite having a lot of studies that suggest there is a relationship between violent video game play and aggression, a lot of that research doesn't follow the standards of good science that would allow us to create that direct link. So, there is a third side to consider to this research as well. It may not be violent video games that are causing people to be aggressive. What if instead the relationship is reversed, where people who are naturally aggressive, who have a personality that is more hostile in nature, seek out violent video games, which then creates this reinforcing cycle where aggressive players seek out violent video games, and those violent video games then make them more aggressive. And so we need to consider again the various possibilities of these relationships. In fact, a 2010 study showed that individuals who had high emotion, high indifference to others, and high in rule breaking behaviors were more likely to experience these negative effects that violent video game studies have shown than the general public. So, again, we could be talking about a reinforcing effect rather than an effect that is created in the typical person. So there are other concerns with gaming, despite other than just violence and how that affects our psyche. There is also a new mental health condition from the World Health Organization called gaming disorder, and it suggests that people can become addicted to gaming in terms of needing it as a mental health strategy. Now, 8.5% of Americans are considered addicted to video game play. This is actually lower than some countries, such as Germany and China. Uh, Even though South Korea has one of the highest sales of video games, they actually only have 4% of their population who are considered addicted. But again, this could be for many reasons. South Korea doesn't have as high of an emphasis on mental health diagnosis. But also, the World Health Organization suggests that males are more likely to be addicted, and people who are younger are more likely to be addicted to gaming. Now, there is also the consideration of what is considered appropriate for gaming. You saw some very violent video games. Should my 6-year-old be able to play that game? Well, I'm her parent, so I get to decide that, right? And in this household, we decide definitely not. But there is a new rating system that has been created that emphasizes whether content is mature, whether it's violent, whether it has representation of different people groups that are perhaps not culturally appropriate. And it seems that with the introduction of the new ESRB ratings, that there are less and less mature rated games. As of, I believe this figure is from 2019, there were 9% of games that were rated M, which was down from 13% in 2017. Additional concerns of gaming include misogyny, which is the portrayal of women as sexual creatures, as less than in terms of comparison to males, and just how that reflection of women can translate into our ideals of what a woman should look like, how we should treat women, and things like that. So, misogyny has typically always been a large concern within the gaming industry, but it's become increasingly so as more and more games are developed with unrealistic expectations of women. In addition, we have a concern about the lack of diversity in characterization, as well as within the industry itself, who's developing those video games. And so there has been a growing emphasis on trying to diversify gaming, both because it's socially appropriate to do so and important to do so, but also so that you can widen the reach and the audience for games. Now, we will talk a lot in our discussion board about Gamergate, but I thought I would provide a short introduction. Gamergate was created when female journalists were trying to write about the gaming industry as experts. These were women who were hardcore gamers who were, going to good sources, they were doing good journalism. But because they were women and because they were talking about games, specifically the inclusion of misogyny and lack of diversity in gaming, they were readily attacked by anonymous gamers using the hashtag Gamergate. And we're talking about extreme harassment online, not only people messaging them terrible things. There were women who, they would take their profile photo and then act. The people who were sending this, the harassers, would, put their faces on top of pornographic images, or they would show them being beaten up. There were actual threats made to these women's lives. And Gamergate really exposed some of the negative misogynistic culture that existed in some gaming communities. Now, of course, we know that this is an extreme instance of hate against women, and certainly not every video game player, or not even every male video game player, would rise to this level or even agree with these people. But there was a very large movement behind Gamergate that suggested that this was perhaps happening more than people realized. Now, we've talked about the negative effects of gaming. So, why on earth would we allow video games to continue to be pervasive in our culture? Well, the truth is that there are many positive effects of gaming. And in fact, a lot of research has shown that the positive effects of gaming often outweigh its negatives. There are many cognitive benefits or brain benefits to gaming. Users who play shooter games, which again are usually criticized for harming our intelligence and harming our our ability to be good people. Studies show that shooter games, people who play them have faster and more accurate attention allocation. They can recognize spatial and visual processing problems better, and they have mental rotation abilities, which means they can think from various perspectives. It can also enhance children's creative capabilities, according to research. There are also emotional benefits to gaming. Games that have low cognitive demands, that don't require a lot of thinking, for instance, can improve your mood, promote relaxation, and keep anxiety at bay. And there are many teachers who have found that the benefits of dealing with frustration and anxiety uh, can really happen through gaming system. Now, in addition, there are motivational benefits. Games often teach basic lessons about persistence and the failure, and how you can deal with failure. And this can be a really good thing to teach young children, that trying to reach a goal and continuing to fight for it time and time again, even after you fail, even after you get that game over, having that desire to reach a goal can increase motivation to do that in real life. And there are additional social benefits. Lots of gaming is social and it utilizes cooperative play. So having multiplayer games can help people who play them um, have an increased desire to help others. And that includes even in violent video games. So you've heard conflicting research where for some people, violent video games makes them want to help people less, but there has been research that shows that people who play violent video games actually help each other more. Now, again, you're likely to help those people who are on your quote unquote team, and people who you see as outsider, you'd be more willing to attack. But the social benefits of having that teamwork built into gaming is important. So violent games played cooperatively seem to decrease players' access to aggressive cognitions as well. So you can see a lot of conflicting research about whether violent video games are truly as bad as they say. Now, if you're interested in gaming, Montevallo actually has their own social club for gamers, which you should definitely check out. Looks like a fun group. So now that we've talked about both the negative and positive benefits of gaming, I want you to go ahead and go into your discussion board. It will be primarily about Gamergate. Please keep in mind that this is a very sensitive issue, particularly for females in the class who may have experienced this type of sexual harassment, either online or in person. So please be respectful with your comments. I myself have been a victim of sexual harassment, both online and in person. So just be professional in the ways that you talk about this. Even if you have a contrary opinion, that's fine. Just go ahead and present it in a way that you would be willing to say to a sexual harassment victim space. Just keep that in mind. But I hope that you guys have enjoyed this section on gaming. It certainly is a fun one, regardless of whether, you just love Pac-Man and don't play anything else, or whether you're a hardcore gamer. If you have any questions about this unit or anything in the class, please feel free to reach out to me. Have a great rest of your week.